cautiously hopeful, with a muddy boot planted firmly in reality. Spring, they said, was a time of rebirth, which was funny, because for the average medieval peasant, it was mostly a time of mud, disease, and desperate repair work. Yes, the snow melted. Yes, the days got longer. But before you got flowers or sunshine, you got rot. Rot in your roof. Rot in your food stores. Rot in your actual soul. The ground, once frozen solid, now transformed into a squelching soup that swallowed boots, whole. You didn't walk across your yard. You waded. Chickens vanished into puddles. Pigs slipped and fell like tragic drunks. Every step was a gamble, and you still had to work in it. Spring meant labor. Endless, back-breaking, finger-blistering labor. You plowed fields with tools that looked like punishment devices. You scattered seed by hand, all while praying the crows weren't watching. You repaired fences, patched holes, dug trenches. Everything had broken in winter. Now it was your job to fix it, usually with nothing but string, prayer, and the sheer audacity of hope. And just when you thought you might survive, plague. Spring was when fevers returned with a vengeance. Winter had weakened everyone. Now, the rivers swelled, the rats multiplied, and every sniffle felt like a death sentence. The local wise woman gave out herbal poultices made from things that smelled like dead frog. Sometimes they worked. Sometimes you just hallucinated about St. Cuthbert riding a fish. But, amid the mess, something strange began to happen. Children laughed again. Lambs were born. Trees budded. Someone sang a song while fixing a cartwheel. Your neighbor, who'd nearly died in January, showed up with a handful of leeks and a smile missing 3 teeth. And suddenly, the world didn't feel quite so cursed. Markets reopened. Travelers returned. Stories flowed again. News from beyond the next village, beyond the shire, beyond the walls of your life. You remembered what warmth felt like, what possibility tasted like. You had made it. Barely. Tired, weather-beaten, and a little dead inside, but alive. And that, for a medieval peasant, was the greatest victory of all. Because spring wasn't about joy. Not really. It was about momentum. About crawling out of winter's grave and saying, not this year. It was planting seeds and hoping, not knowing. They'd grow. It was scrubbing mud from your floor for the 10th time and pretending it mattered. It was picking up the pieces, because what else was there to do? You didn't get a medal. No songs were sung, but your body was still moving, your hearth was lit, and the earth, unreliable as ever, was waking up. So the cycle would begin again. More toil, more hunger, more close calls, but also more firelight, more bread, more life. For a medieval peasant, survival was the story, and somehow, against every odd, it continued. Winter in the medieval countryside was not a season, it was a siege. Snow didn't fall gently, it arrived, like an invading army. One day the air was crisp, the next you were waking up under 6 inches of white death, staring at a thatch roof that now functioned more like a sponge. Everything slowed in winter, except the hunger. That never stopped. Food was rationed with grim precision. You counted every turnip, measured every handful of grain, eyed your neighbor's goose with thoughts you weren't proud of. There were no fresh vegetables, no markets, no, let's just eat out tonight. It was whatever you had managed to store during autumn, now slowly vanishing from your cellar, one moldy apple at a time. And the cold, relentless. Firewood disappeared, faster than hope. If you ran out, you didn't freeze quickly. You froze slowly, limb by limb, dignity optional. You wore everything you owned, slept under every rag you could find, and still woke up with your hair ice to your forehead. If you were lucky, your house had a fireplace. If you were unlucky, you had a smoky hole in the wall, and a hope that carbon monoxide poisoning wasn't real. Water came from snow, which meant melting it. which meant burning firewood, which meant choosing between drinking and not dying of hypothermia. Medieval choices were never easy. But let's say you did have food and fire. Great, you still had to worry about illness. Winter was the season of coughs that became death rattles. A sniffle could turn into pneumonia. A minor scratch could become gangrenous. Medicine was, let's be generous and call it experimental. Treatments involved things like hot poultices, leeches, and prayers said with increasing desperation. If that didn't work, well, at least the ground was too frozen to bury you immediately. So you'd wait in the corner until the thaw, respectfully, and, yet despite the misery, life went on. Children still played, indoors with bones and string. Adults passed the time repairing tools, mending clothes, or crafting small items they could maybe trade come spring. People told stories, legends, old songs, news from travelling peddlers or the priest who'd been to the next village over. Gossip was a lifeline. Entertainment, social glue. And sometimes, rarely, hope. Some households shared what little they had, others didn't, and fights broke out. Feuds simmered. Long-standing grudges boiled over in the cold, dark months. But there was also care. Neighbours checked on the old widow down the road. Someone gave up a strip of cloth for a baby's swaddling. A loaf of bread would silently appear on someone's doorstep. Not charity, just survival, distributed one crumb at a time. Holidays were a strange, brief joy. Midwinter feasts offered a rare excuse to break into the good stuff. Salted meat, sweet ale, maybe even a preserved pear if you hadn't eaten it in a moment of weakness back in November. Families gathered, they sang, they prayed, they clung to the idea that light would return, because make no mistake, winter ate people, children died, the week wasted away. You could do everything right, store food, patch your roof, keep the hearth burning, and still not make it. And if you did survive, you didn't celebrate. You staggered out into the mud of early spring like a ghost wearing a potato sack, wondering what fresh madness the next season had in store. So what was the secret to surviving winter as a medieval peasant? Endurance, community, a bit of stubbornness, and knowing that, just maybe, on the other side of this endless grey season, the sun would rise again, and with it, life. Until then, you survived the only way you could. One spoon of gruel, one dry cough, one more day without dying. That beautiful season when the leaves turn gold, the air grows crisp, and every medieval peasant realizes they're still not done, not even close. Because if summer was a punch in the face, autumn was a tax collector who shows up while you're still icing your nose and then takes your bread. Let's start with the harvest. Yes, again. No, you're not imagining it. You harvested in summer, but now you're harvesting everything else. Root vegetables, nuts, apples, pears, beans, onions. Basically, anything that didn't melt in July is ready now. So while the nobility sipped cider under a tapestry, peasants were ankle-deep in mud pulling up turnips and muttering, "Please don't let this frost early." And this wasn't casual foraging. This was sprinting against time. Autumn brought shorter days, unpredictable rain, and an ever-present sense that winter was just around the corner, sharpening its icicles. Everything had to be gathered, cleaned, sorted, dried, or preserved. Apples had to be stored in cellars, onions braided and hung, beans shelled, cabbages smelled weird, but you still had to pack them in barrels with salt and hope for the best. Meanwhile, grain that had been threshed in late summer now had to be ground. So, off it went to the miller, who, by the way, took a hefty cut for himself. And if your lord was feeling generous, you got to keep enough flour to bake maybe one small loaf and 3 prayers for next week. The rest, taxed, which brings us to the true horror of autumn: paying dues. This is when your feudal obligations came due. You owed your lord a share of everything: grain, vegetables, eggs, even livestock. And don't forget the church. God's portion had to be paid too, or you'd risk eternal damnation and getting side-eyed by the village priest during Mass. So you gathered your produce, carried it in a handcart with a busted wheel, and delivered it to the manor like a grim, Little Santa Claus with nothing to show for it. And no, you couldn't argue. You couldn't bargain. The tithe collector did not care that your pig died or that your cabbages turned to slime. If your tax wasn't ready, they'd take it anyway. Or worse, they'd take something else. Tools, blankets, your only good tunic. Sometimes even your child, if you owed labour. Congratulations, Timothy. You're working in Lord Bartholomew's grain pit now. Hope you like splinters. As if that weren't enough, autumn also meant slaughter season. Winter was coming, and feed was limited, so you had to cull the herd. The old, the weak, the unlucky, off they went. The good news? Meat. The bad news. Butchering in medieval conditions was not a clean affair. It was messy, bloody, and somehow always happened when you had a head cold. You preserved what you could, salting, smoking, drying, but most of it went bad anyway. And if you didn't have a smokehouse or enough salt, well, enjoy your maggot jerky. And the weather? Oh, it was charming. Cold mornings, damp afternoons, surprise rainstorms that turned your home into a bog. Your boots, if you even had any, never dried. Your roof leaked, your bones ached. But hey, at least you had stew, or broth, or a rock you boiled until it tasted vaguely like the memory of meat. Still, amidst all the chaos, autumn had its moments. The Harvest Festival brought rare joy, music, dancing, too much ale, and questionable decisions behind haystacks. People got married, babies were baptized, and old folks sat near the hearth telling stories that may or may not have involved actual dragons. For a brief moment, the village came alive, not just with survival, but with living. But even those joys came with consequences. Autumn was when death made its rounds, not dramatic plague style, just quiet, creeping decay. The elderly who'd made it through summer heat now faced the cold. Wounds festered. Colds became fevers, food spoiled, hope thinned. And always, in the distance, the echo of winter's footsteps. Slow, steady, unavoidable. So peasants worked faster, hunted for firewood, repaired roofs with straw and prayers, patched clothes with scraps and desperation. They salted, dried, stitched, stacked, hoarded. Every act was a small defiance against the long freeze to come. Autumn was not rest. It was the final sprint before the freeze. The last chance to prepare, to gather, to mend. And if you didn't get it done, you wouldn't make it to spring. Summer. The birds are singing, the sun is blazing, and the peasants are screaming quietly into their barley fields. Because while summer for you might mean iced drinks, beach vacations, and pretending you'll finally read that book, for a medieval peasant, summer meant one thing: work, non-stop, bone grinding, sunburn-inducing, work. As soon as the sun peeked over the hills, the village was in motion. Peasants didn't need alarm clocks. They had roosters, sawbacks, and the crushing awareness that if today's work didn't get done, winter would kill you slowly. Fields needed constant tending, weeding, watering, checking for pests, patching up fences, herding stubborn livestock, fixing the tools they broke yesterday with the tools they'd break today. It was an unending blur of chores that piled up, faster than a sermon at Sunday Mass. And the sun, the sun was not your friend. Peasants didn't have hats or sunscreen. What they had was a thin linen tunic, sun-scorched skin, and a deeply personal relationship with heat stroke. By midday, the fields shimmered like a furnace, and Geoffrey was out there cursing at turnips while slowly baking into jerky. There was no such thing as a break. If the sky wasn't actively killing you with lightning, you were expected to be in the field with your hands in the dirt, mumbling prayers to Saint Isidore that the barley wouldn't rot again this year. Meanwhile, nature had other torments in store. Swarms of flies descended like biblical plagues, mosquitoes hunted you like blood-sucking falcons, and even your hair wasn't safe. Lice had taken up permanent residence and weren't paying rent. You slapped, scratched, and squinted through the clouds of bugs, trying to act like this was fine, like you weren't slowly going mad from the itching and buzzing and biting. And then came haymaking. That innocent-sounding task where you cut down grass to store for winter feed. But it wasn't a pleasant stroll through a meadow. It was hours of swinging a heavy scythe under the brutal sun, your arms turning to jelly, your neck redder than the bishop's robes, and your back screaming louder than the town drunk on feast day. Then, after cutting, you raked. After raking, you turned it. After turning it, you stacked it. And if a single cloud had the audacity to rain, you dropped everything and ran to cover it. Because wet hay meant rot, and rot meant no food for the animals, and no food for the animals meant dried meat with extra famine this winter. But the real summer crucible was the grain harvest, the main event, the all-hands-on-deck do-or-die finale. The window was short. Get it done before the rain or risk total failure. So you grabbed your sickle, joined a line of equally exhausted villagers, and began slashing stalks of wheat from dawn to dusk. It was backbreaking, hand-shredding, sun-scorched labour, and every minute counted. Because if that grain spoiled, if it moulded or blew away or got eaten by rats, you didn't just lose a meal. You lost months of survival. After the cutting came bundling, then hauling, then threshing, winnowing and storing, usually in a granary, that smelled like old sweat and mouse droppings. And what did you eat during all this? Mostly crusts, maybe a bit of cheese, a hunk of bread if you were lucky. Meals were whatever you could grab between one exhausting task and the next. Sleep, if you were lucky. Some peasants slept in shifts, some just passed out on haystacks. The day ended only when the stars came out, or when your body gave up and dropped you like a sack of beets. Still, not everything was misery. Summer brought festivals too, brief moments of joy tucked between the chaos. Holy days offered rare breaks, a church mass, a shared meal, some music, maybe a few bad decisions involving ale and dancing. There were even fairs, with jugglers, pigs in ribbons, and teenagers sneaking off behind barns to do what teenagers do. It was a rare moment to laugh, flirt, and pretend, for just a few hours, that you weren't one goat theft away from eternal damnation. But joy was always fleeting. Summer also meant disease season. Warm weather and stagnant wells were a perfect storm for dysentery, fevers, and mysterious plagues the village healer couldn't name. One bad sip of water, and you might spend your final days sweating in a corner, while the priest asked if you had any sins to confess. And if disease didn't get you, fire might. Thatched roofs and dry grass turned entire villages into kindling. One spark, one overturned lantern, and suddenly you're watching your grain store and your neighbour's cow barn go up like a midsummer bonfire. Except without the dancing. Summer wasn't a vacation. It was a test of endurance, resilience, and the ability to carry 3 bundles of wheat while being chased by hornets. And somehow, year after year, peasants passed it. Because every harvest meant life. Every sheaf meant another chance to survive the cold months ahead. And so they scythed. They stacked, they sweated, and they survived. Your roof didn't cave in. Your last turnip didn't rot, and that weird cough didn't turn into full-blown death. You've emerged from the medieval deep freeze like a mouldy potato shoved under the bed since November. Wrinkled, confused, and definitely still hungry. But now, it's spring. The birds are singing. The snow is melting. The mud is at least new mud, not the frozen brick you've been chipping ice off for 4 months. And suddenly, the village smells slightly less like smoke and misery, and more like fertile optimism and manure. Lots of manure, because springtime in the Middle Ages wasn't a gentle pastel-coloured wonderland. It was more like survivor's mode, unlocked. You didn't ease into it, you crawled. Let's talk about food, or the lack thereof. See, winter didn't just starve people during winter. It set up a delayed food panic for early spring. By now, your dried beans are gone. Your salted pork is gone. Your pickled cabbage has either been eaten or used to plug a roof hole. All you've got left is a handful of shriveled carrots, some mystery grain from the bottom of a sack, and maybe, a half loaf of bread you're willing to stab someone for. This is called the hunger gap, the dead zone between the last of the stored food and the first actual crops. It's like being told dessert is coming, but first you have to eat 3 more weeks of disappointment and boiled moss. So what? Do you eat anything? Nettles, grass, bark tea, stinging weeds boiled into a flavourless soup called pottage, which is basically medieval peasant for hot water sadness. And if someone did still have grain, they weren't eating it. They were planting it, because spring punched planting season, which meant it was time to turn your muddy, frozen solid fields into something resembling food production. You, your kids, your ox, if it survived, and possibly your emotionally damaged neighbour, would all take to the fields with wooden ploughs and blind optimism. The ground would still be half frozen. You'd hit rocks, you'd lose a boot, someone would cry. But you'd do it anyway, because hope is what you plant when there's literally nothing left to eat. And it wasn't just crops that needed reviving. Your animals were a mess. Your chickens looked like half-deflated pillows. Your pigs were skinny and bitter. Your one remaining cow hadn't given milk since December and now looked at you like she was considering legal action. So spring meant getting everything back to work. Fast. If the chickens didn't lay, if the sheep didn't grow wool, if the cow didn't recover, guess what? No eggs, no clothes, no cheese. And no cheese in the Middle Ages was basically a death sentence. Because what else are you going to eat? Flavourless turnip slop again? But despite the hunger and the mud and the emotional trauma, spring also meant possibility. Like real possibility. There were signs of life. Snowdrops, early flowers, baby animals. The return of birds that hadn't screamed at you in weeks. And of course, with spring came the church calendar events, which, surprise, offered both hope and more ways to suffer. First came Lent, the annual 40-day spiritual cleanse where you voluntarily gave up all good food, meat, dairy, eggs, and replaced it with prayer and guilt. Which honestly wasn't a huge ask, because at this point, you probably didn't have any meat, dairy, or eggs left anyway. So the church basically just told you to keep starving, but now it counted as holy starving. Then came Easter, which finally meant feasting, a real celebration. Assuming you hadn't died by then, and you'd managed to trade something for a rabbit or a pigeon, you could finally eat like a half-decent peasant again. Bread, eggs, maybe even, gasp, a bit of cheese. And if you were really lucky, you'd have May Day to look forward to, when the village broke out the floral wreaths, danced around a pole for some reason, and pretended they hadn't spent the last 5 months in a shivering existential crisis. By now, everyone was crawling out of their houses, blinking at the sun like mouldy vampires. The kids ran around like feral goats. The elderly sighed in relief. And someone probably tried to have sex in a field because nothing said spring like desperate fertility rituals dressed up as rural partying. But don't get too comfortable, because while spring brought warmth and light, it also brought disease. Oh, yes, all that melting snow. It turned your roads into raw sewage rivers, that pigsty runoff, now part of your drinking water, and that weakened immune system you developed from 4 months of eating bark and prayer. It was basically a VIP invitation for every bacteria in the neighbourhood. So if winter didn't kill you, spring still might. But even so, you made it. Firewood is running low, but the sun is back. The food is scarce, but you've got seeds in the ground. Your hands are cracked and your knees ache, but your neighbour's not dead and your chickens laid an egg this morning. That's spring. Not beautiful, not magical, just barely enough to keep going. The Middle Ages didn't offer comfort, but they did offer momentum. The wheel kept turning and peasants kept walking. Mud-caked boots, hungry bellies, hope clinging to them like early morning fog. Spring wasn't a reward. It was a second chance, and for a medieval peasant, that was more than enough. So, you've made it to midwinter. You haven't starved, frozen, or been accidentally burned to death by your own fireplace. Congratulations. But surviving the physical cold was only part of the story. You still had to survive the other side, of winter, the one made of darkness, superstition, and things that went bump in the night. Because let's be honest, when it's pitch black for 14 hours a day, you live in a house made of twigs and smoke, and you haven't seen the sun in a month, your brain starts to make things up. Welcome to the psychological gauntlet of medieval winter. See, medieval peasants didn't exactly have Netflix, or therapy, or a science-based understanding of literally anything. So when wolves howled, wind moaned through the cracks in your roof, and your cousin Henry woke up with a rash shaped like a goat hoof, well, clearly that was the devil, or a forest spirit, or a dead ancestor who didn't like how you butchered that pig last Michaelmas. Superstition wasn't a side hobby, it was life insurance. Let's start with the basics. Witches. Witches were the Swiss Army knife of blame. Cow stopped giving milk. Witch. Bread didn't rise. Witch. Your knee hurts when it rains. Definitely. A witch. Especially if she was old, lived alone, and had a mole shaped like Europe. During winter, witches were said to be particularly active, flying around on broomsticks, cursing livestock, spoiling beer, and occasionally stealing your soul while you slept. To protect yourself, you might hang iron above your door, sprinkle holy water in your soup, or sleep with garlic stuffed in your boots. Sure, your feet stank, but at least you weren't cursed. Probably. And then there were the spirits of the dead. Winter was the season when the veil between worlds was thinnest, or so they believed. Long, cold nights were perfect for ghost stories, and peasants had a lot of them. There were tales of restless souls wandering the woods, looking for warmth or revenge, stories of children stolen by fairy folk on icy nights, never to be seen again, unless they returned 20 years later, slightly taller and very confused. And don't forget the wild hunt. A ghostly parade of hunters on spectral horses, galloping through the sky, collecting lost souls like they were medieval Pokemon. If you heard hoofbeats above your house in January, you didn't say, "Oh, Santa's, early!" You screamed, threw a cross at the ceiling, and hid under the turnip sack. But fear wasn't just limited to ghosts. No, winter was also peak religious anxiety season. With long nights came long prayers. You prayed to avoid sickness. You prayed for your stored grain to last. You prayed your soul wouldn't freeze inside your body and shatter like a dropped clay pot. Medieval Christianity had no chill in winter. It was all fire, brimstone, and stern warnings from the village priest. And that's when you actually had a priest. If your local clergyman had already frozen solid, you were left with old Martyr, the toothless, who interpreted the Bible mostly through interpretive dance and loud opinions about the moon. To make things worse, winter was seen as a season of punishment, a cold reminder of sin, mortality, and why you really should have gone to confession after stealing that goose. Suffering was seen as holy, so if you were miserable, cold, hungry, and convinced the devil was watching you through the keyhole, well, congrats. You were on the right path to heaven, and if you wanted to ensure protection, you might carry a charm, something like a little pouch of herbs, a carved bone, or a scrap of scripture sewed into your underwear. Bonus points if it smelled bad. Demons hated weird smells, apparently, which might explain why hygiene wasn't a winter priority. Speaking of smells, did we mention that during winter, no one bathed? Bathing was dangerous. Not only could you catch a chill, but water was often frozen solid or had to be hauled in by hand, heated, and poured into a wooden tub you shared with your entire family. By the time it was your turn, the water looked like stew and smelled like defeat. So what did you do instead? You prayed the stink away, and maybe changed your linen. Once, in February. Despite all this fear and funk, winter wasn't all doom and gloom. Superstition also offered comfort. In a world that made no sense, where you could freeze to death next to your own fire, blaming a ghost or a woodland sprite was oddly reassuring. It gave you a reason, a story, a way to say, this suffering isn't random. It's the invisible goat demons again. It's easy to mock now, sitting in our heated homes with double-paned windows and scientifically debunked witch trials. But back then, superstition was coping. It gave peasants control, or at least the illusion of it. It made winter into a story they could live through, rather than a void they might disappear into. So while they feared the dark, they also faced it with stories, rituals and songs. Songs to scare off spirits. Songs to welcome angels. Songs to distract the kids. while you quietly checked the granary for rats, or ghosts, or ghost rats. Because in the Middle Ages, winter was a spiritual battlefield. Every creak of the floorboards, every flicker of the hearth, every icy gust of wind, it all meant something. And the peasants' job? To survive it, with faith, fire, garlic in their boots, and the absolute certainty that if something bad happened, it probably wasn't their fault. Probably. End of part 5. Would you like part 6 to explore how peasants celebrated the return of spring? Festivals, rituals, Lent, planting again, etc. Or should we dive into the aftermath of winter? What survival looked like when your food was gone, your livestock was skinny, and everyone smelled like smoke and sorrow? Ever tried sleeping in a room with 15 people, 3 goats, and a chicken named Mildred, all huddled together for warmth? Welcome to a typical January night in a medieval peasant's life. Privacy? That's a modern fantasy. In winter, survival meant closeness, physically, emotionally, and occasionally involuntarily when someone passed wind under the wool blanket. Now let's talk beds, or rather straw-filled sacks that vaguely resembled bedding. These mattresses were communal. Hotspots. Warmth was shared, bugs included. If you were lucky, your spot was near the center. If not, you were the human draft excluder by the door. Congratulations, you've just earned frostbite. Clothing was layered, recycled, and rarely washed. You wore everything you owned, slept in it, worked in it, and by midwinter, probably developed a personal ecosystem. Smelling like a damp sheep wasn't a fashion crime. It was a sign of common sense. Cold kills. Dignity can wait until April. Soup was a winter staple, not the hearty, Instagrammable kind. No, medieval soup was more like vaguely warm water, flavored with hope, and maybe a root vegetable if the gods were merciful. Bread, hard, stale, and weaponizable, was soaked in this so-called broth to soften it. Culinary bliss. Hardly, but it filled bellies and kept people alive. Entertainment in winter? Forget Netflix. You had stories told by the fire, songs about turnips, and the occasional fart contest. Unofficial, of course, but morale-boosting. If someone owned a musical instrument, they were either the village hero or the source of daily headaches, depending on how well they played. And then there was illness. Coughs and fevers spread like gossip at a medieval tavern. With no antibiotics and few remedies beyond superstition, people relied on prayers, herbs, and the vague hope that maybe this wasn't the plague this time. Spoiler, sometimes it was. But hey, at least death came with a blanket. Personal hygiene? Winter turned that from optional to absurd. Bathing was dangerous, cold water meant sickness, and heating water was a luxury. So most folks stayed dirty, layered up, and embraced the musk. If you smelled worse than your neighbor, you probably weren't alone. And that, oddly enough, was comforting. Yet, despite the grime, the cold, and the ever-present threat of starvation, people laughed. They told jokes, shared what little they had, and dreamed of spring. Because medieval life wasn't about thriving, it was about enduring. And if you could do that with a smile and both your toes, you were already winning. The season of snow-covered fields, frozen wells, and intense culinary creativity. Because let's be honest, peasants weren't exactly feasting on roast goose and honey-glazed vegetables, while the wind howled through their poorly insulated homes. No, winter meals were more of a grim performance art piece titled, "Please let this be enough to keep me alive." Let's begin. Before winter even started, peasants were already sweating over it, metaphorically and literally. Autumn wasn't about pumpkin spice or cozy sweaters. It was a manic race to preserve anything vaguely edible before the world turned into a frozen wasteland. That meant salting meat. If you were lucky enough to own a pig, autumn was butchering time. The meat was rubbed with salt and stored in barrels to keep it from rotting. Smoked if you had a smokehouse. Boiled if it started to smell funny. Drying and smoking. Herbs, beans, peas, onions, and even strips of fish or meat were hung near the hearth or in the rafters. Everything dangled from the ceiling like a weird rustic chandelier of desperation. Grain storage, wheat, barley, and rye were stored in sacks, barrels, or pits. But pests were a constant threat. Rats, weevils, mold. So even the best planned granary could turn into a biohazard before February. Pickling. Vegetables went into brine. Cabbages were turned into sauerkraut. Anything that could ferment was fermented, which meant by midwinter, half your diet tasted like vinegar and regret. If you thought peasant food in the summer was sad, wait until you try it in January. The winter diet was repetitive. And by repetitive, we mean porridge for breakfast, porridge for lunch, porridge for dinner, if you're lucky. Here's what the medieval peasant menu looked like. Pottage, a thick stew made from whatever you had, usually a base of barley or oats, with added beans, onions, leeks, turnips, and maybe a scrap of meat if the gods were smiling. Think of it as the original everything stew. It simmered all day over the fire, bubbling away until it looked like hot sludge. Tasted like hot sludge too. Dark bread, made from rye or barley. Dense, sour. Occasionally full of grit from the millstones, which wore down your teeth like medieval dental sandpaper. But bread was sacred. If you had bread, you had hope. Root vegetables, the humble turnip, parsnip, and onion. Easy to store, hard to enjoy. Imagine eating boiled onions 3 times a week and pretending it's a celebration. That's the vibe. Cheese and butter. If your cow survived the cold and didn't dry up, you might have a bit of dairy. But winter milk was rare. Most cheese was from earlier in the year, aged, hard, and sometimes crawling with mystery. Beer and ale, not just for fun, they were safer than water. Low alcohol, small beer was drunk even by children. Bonus, it provided calories. Downside, it sometimes tasted like barley-flavoured foot bath. When rations ran low, which they always did, peasants got creative. And by creative, we mean mildly horrifying. Behold the medieval winter snack bar, tree bark. Yes, some peasants boiled bark into a broth, not because they enjoyed it, but because it had some calories. Inner bark, cambium, from trees like pine could be scraped, dried, ground, and added to flour. Congratulations, you've invented wood bread, frozen rats. Extreme famine sometimes meant trapping small animals, rats, mice, birds, and roasting them over the fire. It wasn't glamorous, but it was. Food adjacent, acorns and chestnuts, technically edible if processed correctly. Otherwise, acorns could make you sick. But when you're already starving, gastrointestinal distress is just part of the journey. Bread crust soup. Take stale bread. Add hot water. Maybe toss in some onion peel. Voila, it's soup. If you're lucky, there's salt in it. If not, enjoy your medieval sadness broth. Here's the truth. Peasants in winter didn't just eat poorly. They often didn't eat enough. Hunger was normal. Starvation was common. The worst months were January through March, known as the starving time. That's when supplies ran out, gardens were still dead, and spring planting hadn't begun. It was like nature holding a very slow middle finger to humanity. Entire villages might ration food into crumbs. Parents would skip meals so children could eat. Some peasants dug up frozen turnips with bare hands. Others bartered, begged, or walked miles in the snow just to find a crust of bread. And yet, most didn't die. Somehow, most peasants made it through. Underfed, exhausted, but alive. Because they knew how to stretch food further than a modern person can stretch a Netflix binge. They had systems of sharing. Communal pots. Barn raisings. If one family had salted pork, they shared it. Because next year, the roles might reverse. Religion played a huge role in making it through the lean months. Fasting was common. Sometimes, because the church required it. Other times because it was the only option. Peasants prayed before meals, not as a ritual, but because eating was a miracle. There was also hope in tradition, stories of saints surviving on crusts, proverbs like hunger sharpens wit, or a lean dog hunts best. In other words, if you were starving, maybe you'd get smarter. Probably not, but medieval optimism had to find its wins where it could. Winter in the Middle Ages was a dietary gauntlet, a trial of root vegetables, stale bread, and mysterious pottage. It was less farm to table and more barn to belly as fast as possible before it rots. But through ingenuity, cooperation, and an unbreakable will to survive, medieval peasants endured. They didn't feast, but they persisted, which is probably why you're here now, because your peasant ancestors managed to make it through a winter on bark soup, dried beans, and communal optimism. So the next time you open your fridge and complain there's nothing to eat, remember, at least your dinner doesn't involve boiling moss and praying. So, where were we? Ah yes, our medieval peasant is now holed up in their glorified mud hut with a thatched roof, a family of 6, and probably a chicken or 2 that's officially part of the household, whether anyone invited it or not. Now comes the real fun, surviving the full brunt of winter in a home that's slightly better insulated than a wet paper bag, but not by much. Let's talk about heating, or as medieval peasants called it, not freezing to death if you're lucky. You see, most peasants didn't have fireplaces. Chimneys were a luxury reserved for the fancy folks, like nobles, or at least the town baker. In your average peasant's home, the fire was usually just a smoky, smouldering heap in the middle of the one-room dwelling. That's right, one room. No kitchen, no bedroom, no bathroom. Just a shared breathing space full of smoke, snoring, and probably someone coughing up something medieval. The fire served many purposes. It kept people warm, sort of. It cooked the food, assuming you had any. And it was the primary source of indoor air pollution strong enough to knock out a horse. Since there was no chimney, the smoke just kind of hung out. You'd think everyone would have suffocated, but no. Centuries of adaptation had given peasants the lung capacity of a coal miner crossed with a dragon. If things got really cold, you might try to insulate your home. With what, you ask? Excellent question. Animal dung. Yes, dried animal dung, straw and mud could be packed into the walls and cracks to keep out drafts. It was like a medieval version of caulking, if caulking was flammable and smelled like a cow exploded. But desperate times call for desperate manure. Now, even with the fire blazing and the walls poop sealed, the temperature inside might only rise a few degrees above freezing. So everyone wore all their clothes, all the time. Layers weren't a fashion choice. They were a survival mechanism. Wool was life, and linen, though not warm on its own, helped trap body heat under wool layers. Think of it like medieval thermal underwear, only scratchier and made by your cousin, who might also be your tailor. At night, people slept together for warmth. Whole families, all bundled under itchy woolen blankets and old furs, snuggled up on straw mattresses, or rather, straw piles, full of bugs, fleas, and, bonus, maybe a mouse or 2 if they were lucky. But hey, at least they didn't freeze. And just when you think, well, this sounds survivable, remember, this was also flu season, and you're living in a house with no ventilation, 6 people, 1 goat, and probably typhoid. Illnesses were a fact of life in winter. Cold, damp conditions were a breeding ground for respiratory infections. Medieval medicine had some creative solutions, of course. Got a nasty cough? Try drinking a potion made of wine, honey, and ground lizard. Or rub goose fat on your chest. Or, pray. A lot. Because, let's be honest, prayer had about the same success rate as the lizard wine. Speaking of wine, did you know it wasn't just for the rich? Even peasants drank alcohol regularly, because water wasn't always safe, especially in winter when streams might freeze or be contaminated. So people drank weak ale or cider, which was basically hydration with a buzz. Even children drank it, which may explain a few things about medieval decision-making. Now let's talk food, or the lack thereof. If your autumn harvest went well, you had sacks of grains stored away. If not, welcome to the wonderful world of turnips and sadness. Root vegetables were the heroes of winter. Turnips, parsnips, onions, and the mighty cabbage. If it grew underground and tasted like dirt, you were eating it. Grain became porridge, or bread, assuming your flour hadn't gone mouldy or been eaten by rats. And let's not forget pottage, the peasants' go-to stew made of whatever was on hand: vegetables, beans, herbs, and if you were lucky, a scrap of bacon fat for flavour. Meat was a rare treat. Salt pork or dried fish maybe, but fresh meat? Only if something conveniently died or if it was a feast day. Oh yes, feast days. A bright spot in a peasant's bleak calendar. Winter had its share of them. Christmas, Twelfth Night, Candlemas. On these days, even the poorest peasants might get a slightly better meal, maybe even some mead or spiced ale, if someone had been hoarding ingredients since summer. Feast days also meant church, singing, community gatherings. Yes, in the freezing. Cold, but hey, humans are social creatures even when frostbitten. It was a chance to take a break from survival and remember that the world hadn't completely ended, despite the snow. Back at home, life was all about rationing, eating less, stretching food, and preserving whatever you could. Pickling, drying, salting. If it had a preservation method, peasants used it. And when all else failed, fasting. Not the trendy kind your coworker does for gut health. This was, we have 4 potatoes left, and it's only January kind of fasting. In the darkest depths of winter, even entertainment had to be homegrown. You couldn't go to the fair or dance around the maypole, but you could tell stories, sing songs, carve wooden spoons, or engage in the highly underrated medieval pastime of complaining to the dog. Children helped pass the time by playing with dolls made from cloth scraps or toys carved from wood. And adults might do spinning, weaving, or simple repairs. Winter wasn't restful. It was just a different kind of busy. You weren't ploughing the fields, but you were sewing next season's clothes, patching tools, and desperately trying to keep everything, and everyone, alive. And here's the real kicker. This was normal. No one expected winter to be fun. They expected it to be hard, and then they got through it, together, huddled close, breathing each other's smoke, and dreaming of spring. And that, my friend, is how medieval peasants survived winter, through dung walls, woolen underwear, lukewarm ale, and the sheer human refusal to give up. Stay tuned for part 3, where we dive into more wintertime delights, like how peasants handled hygiene, vermin, and what happened when the local lord decided he did want to collect taxes in February. Hey everyone, settle in, because tonight we're diving back into the relentless chills and clever survival hacks of medieval peasants. But this time, we're cranking the heat up a notch. Think of this as survival 2.0. We're talking food shortages that could starve a crow, makeshift lanterns that barely flicker, and community schemes so ingenious they'd make NASA jealous. If you're new here, hit that like button if you're into medieval misery, and subscribe for more tales of life before Netflix. Drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from and what's the coldest you've ever been. When the sun sank below the horizon in a medieval village, it wasn't just the temperature that plummeted, it was morale too. Peasants had already used up half their meagre firewood by midday, and every hearth looked like a dwindling hope. Food supplies? Picture a pantry where the only thing left is a handful of split peas and a single shriveled turnip that could double as a paperweight. Breakfast was less "good morning" and more "please don't let this be mold." Hunger was a beast of its own. Families rationed meals so tightly you'd think they were counting grains of salt. One thin porridge at dawn, another at dusk, if you were lucky. By midday, kids were rummaging through pig slop for scraps, while grandmas knitted extra pockets into their skirts to hide a slice of stale bread for emergencies. Spoiler, everyone knew where those pockets were. But peasants weren't mere victims of circumstance. Oh no, they fought back with desperate brilliance. When grain ran out, they gathered fallen acorns, roasted them over the smoke-filled hearth, then ground them into coffee-like grinds. Granted, the result tasted like burnt shoe leather, but it got the heart pumping. Foraging parties scoured the frozen forest for wild herbs, bark, and onion-scented moss. Yes, onion-scented. They mashed leaves into a bitter tea that supposedly warded off scurvy, although in truth it probably just gave you indigestion. Lighting was another battleground. Wax candles were a luxury reserved for the manor house, and tallow candles smelled like rancid bacon, but at least they burned. Some peasants melted scraps of animal fat, dipped twisted rags into the goo, and stuck them in hollowed-out wooden staves. These drip torches burned erratically, set ceilings alight more often than not, and released enough smoke to choke a goat. Yet by flickering lamplight and through watering eyes, families mended clothes, carved simple toys for their children, and played games of knucklebones, because what else are you going to do at 6 p.m. when the fire's on its last ember? Let's talk sickness. In winter, illness spread faster than gossip. A cough in one corner of the hut, and soon everyone was hacking like a pack of hounds. Remedies ranged from drawing blood with leeches, ouch, to drinking concoctions of boiled cow dung mixed with honey. Doctors, if you could even call them that, wore ridiculous masks stuffed with herbs to filter the miasma. It's a wonder more peasants didn't just die of fright. Communal care became a necessity. When Mary the miller's daughter spiked a fever, neighbours took shifts rocking her cradle, feeding her sips of lukewarm broth. Others trudged through snowdrifts to fetch willowbark aspirin from the woods. If the healer's remedies failed, and often they did, the whole village gathered around the hearth for vigils, praying that the little one would pull through till spring thaw. Still, bleak as it sounds, humour was the unsung weapon against despair. Jokes about frostbitten toes, roasted relatives by the fire, and dogs that walked sideways on ice were shared between stifled giggles. One clever fellow attached bits of straw to his boots so he could swish across the floor like a dancing scarecrow, fine until he crashed into the hearth and nearly singed his eyebrows off. The spectacle reminded everyone that even when you're nearly frozen solid, you can always warm up with laughter. And then there were the village caravans. No, not like Arabian Nights, but groups of peasants hauling sleds of supplies from one hamlet to the next. They'd link arms, forge a human chain across a frozen river, and assure each other the ice would hold. More than once, the ice cracked with a thunderous splash, sending a flailing shepherd tumbling into the black water below. Drag him out, drape him in cloaks, stoke his teeth-chattering frame by the hearth, and above all, remind him to keep that secret between friends. But let's not forget the darker edges of survival. When food ran out and barns lay empty, villagers resorted to bartering with the travelling monks, exchanging bits of heated rock wrapped in cloth for bread. Others snuck onto the lord's land at night to filch potatoes from his fields, praying the manor's dogs wouldn't catch them. Punishments for poaching were harsh, a stint in the stocks, public humiliation, or worse. Yet hunger made thieves of us all when the carcasses in the smokehouse turned skeletal. As winter dragged on, the forest around the village grew eerily silent. Even wildlife seemed to vanish, save for the occasional wolf pack howling at the moon like mournful ghosts. Dogs howled back, children shivered through nightmares of being dragged into the woods, and the bravest men kept torches lit all night. One legend told of a pale figure, half man, half frost, who stalked lost travellers. Whether real or just a frightful tale spun by old wives, it was enough to keep even the boldest soul huddled close to the hearth. By now, you might wonder how on earth they lasted until brew season, or any kind of spring revival. And that, my friends, is where our tale pauses, because the real test was yet to come. Sending parties out to mend fences after the thaw, rebuild collapsed roofs, and plant next year's seed, all while still nursing frost-chapped wounds and lingering coughs. How did they muster the strength? What strange alliances formed in the mud as they scrambled to save the harvest? And what new threats lurked beyond the tree line once the snow finally melted away? We'll pick up that story next time. But for now, give yourselves a pat on the back for making it through another chilly night. At least your heaters still work, right? Don't forget to like, subscribe, and drop in the comments what survival trick you'd steal from a medieval peasant. Until next time, keep your coals banked and your wits about you. You never know when history might repeat its frosty tricks.